All right. The title of this episode of The Rational Educator is The Poison of Privilege. And if you are stumbling on this video and you're assuming that the title means that those who have privilege are poisonous to other people that don't have privilege, then you're in the wrong place, because we're here to talk about how poisonous the very idea of privilege as it's used in our modern woke society is, and how it has poisoned particularly the education system, but the culture at large. Now, let's start off with a definition, though, because we need to define our terms and we need to make sure that we're on common ground here of what it means, what the very idea of privilege means in today's world. So to do that, we'll turn over to Dr. Andrew Bernstein, one of our resident experts on education and philosophy. Andy, what is privilege?
Well, I mean, the way it's used by our woke establishment today, it's supposed to be, it's ostensibly an anti-racist term or element. But the truth is, it's packed with racism. And it's the idea, that just being born white is an unearned advantage in this society, and that it's packed in with a Marxist, philosophy of war between classes, or war between groups of people in society, the oppressor and the oppressed. In this case, I mean, white people of their very nature oppress non-whites in this society. So that's what they mean. That's what they mean when they talk about white privilege. And notice the last point I want to make on this is, notice the racism that's packed into this, because I think a rational definition of racism is thinking, that race matters, race is important, as opposed to people who are individualists and who are colorblind, who recognize that race doesn't matter. We're filming this on January 17th, as Martin Luther King's birthday. And so I think we should point out it's content of character day, right? Content of character over color of skin day. That's how rational people understand it. How much pigmentation somebody has in their skin is irrelevant, doesn't matter. What matters is their character. So the racists of any kind, and they come in all shapes and sizes, believe that race, or your ethnicity, or nationality, or tribe, what tribe you're in, some kind of biological collective determines determines your character, and of course your intellectual ability. It's a determinist theory. It's hardwired. Our character and our intellectual ability are hardwired into our biology, into our racial makeup. And look, the part of the claim here of white privilege, baked into it, is the idea that white people inherently are racist. White people are born as racist. And that is a racist claim by an entire group. It completely overlooks that white people, like anybody else, are individuals. They make moral choices. Some choose racism, some choose colorblind individualism. It's a completely racist idea. It's false, it's pernicious, and it should not be taught to children. That shouldn't be taught to anybody. In fact, you can't teach it, because teaching implies some element of truth that you're passing on to other people. This is completely false. It's propaganda, and it shouldn't be propagandized to anybody, certainly not to young children in the elementary schools.
Well, what's particularly ugly about this idea and how it's used today is that, and if you are coming from a Marxist perspective, or if you can crawl into the head of a Marxist for just a moment to understand what they're basing this idea from, is the idea of power dynamics, and how anyone who has more power, more wealth, more privilege than others needs to feel guilty for it.
How about having more pigmentation? Maybe the people who have more pigmentation are better off than the people who have less.
Now, of course, that the reason that the white pigmentation is considered to be the lesser, or the more the race that should feel more guilt, is it has its roots in the belief that whites occupy the top of the power pyramid, they need to have guilt shoveled upon them, and they need to accept that in order to achieve some kind of moral height. If that's where this idea is coming from, if the guilt is being levied on someone who really has no choice in the matter, what kind of guilt can that be? Like, this is a completely unearned guilt. If we look at it as an unearned guilt, something that can only be justified if you think that the sins of your forebears have any effect on your own moral choices. But if that's the kind of guilt that's being levied on people who have no choice in the matter today, what happens to children in the education system where this idea is everywhere? So, Deanna, what kind of effect does an education system that pushes the privilege ideology on children?
Well, what it does is it first off, it really points out, and I've seen this in students that I've tutored, and I'm talking young students, second grade, where they were like BLM curriculum was brought in, and they were learning that, white people are inherently pretty much just evil or the wrong, or so basically they're teaching white kids that they're bad and that they really should feel shame and guilt. And then they're teaching any kid of color, which this goes in tandem with it, that they are victims and that it's, at the hand of the white people. So you're really putting kids against each other at a very young age. And that is vile. That is abuse. That is just, it makes my blood boil. It is so upsetting. And I have seen this. I've talked to student, a little young, sweet girl. And it's really sad. Another thing that it does is that there's a privilege walk. And when I was teaching at the college, we had opening day where all the faculty would come back to campus after summer break. And there would be different workshops and different things that the college would put on. They would feed us lunch and breakfast, and they did the privilege walk. And that was one of the sessions that it was all faculty were supposed to join. I went up to my office. I figured my time was better off working and prepping and, getting all my stuff set for that next week when school was going to start. But basically what it is, it's shaming. And if you haven't heard of the privilege walk, you can Google it. And I'll just read a couple of the statements. So basically you line everybody up on one line. And there were a lot of sociology classes and social science classes that were doing this in college. And it is now being pushed down to middle schoolers. But these are the statements that are read. And it says, if your ancestors were forced to come to the USA, not by choice, take one step back. If your primary ethnic identity is American, take one step forward. If there were people who worked for your family as servants, gardeners, nannies, take one step forward. If you were ever ashamed or embarrassed of your clothes, house, car, take one step back. And it just goes on. And basically what it is that it's supposed to be kind of separating those that have privilege and those that don't. But if you read the question, they're very pointed to kind of, make sure that the white kids are, for the most part, going to go up towards the front of the line, and any kid of color will be in the back. And then after this, you all sit in a circle and you debrief and you talk about how it made you feel if you were at the front or if you were at the back. And ultimately it is a public shaming. You might as well just put the stocks out on a college campus or a middle school campus and throw fruit and rotten vegetables in kids' faces, because it is that shaming and it is disgusting and vile. And there's no purpose of doing this other than to make, the facilitator feel it, and usually the facilitator is trying to bring awareness of diversity and inclusion, but it's just absolutely wretched. So you're either going to teach students to lie publicly or to feel shame, or, what is I can't even imagine what the end result of this is. And I've read it, I've studied it, I've seen it in action, and I still can't imagine why somebody would ever think this was a good idea, and it has spread like wildfire.
You know,
Andy, what does
let me,
this do for self-esteem in a young person?
that's a good question, Joel. Can I just comment on what
Yeah.
Deanna said and then get to your question? There's two things that occurred to me while you were speaking, Deanna. One, when you were talking about the indoctrination of the young children. Yeah, I don't know who it harms more, the white kids or the kids of color, because the white kids are shamed into an undeserved guilt, and the people of color, kids of color, are taught that they're victims. And does that mean that then they cannot make their own way in the world? I mean, I know at Berkeley there was some, I don't know if it was professors or student group at Berkeley claimed that to say that people can make their own way in the world is a microaggression. So I mean, my God. So that was one thing that that occurred to me when you were speaking. And then the other was, it's obvious, no matter how much these people claim to be fighting racism, it's obvious that they're not. Because if they were sincere about fighting racism, they would embrace individualism. The idea that people are individuals, first, foremost, and always, who make moral choices, and that's what decides their worth as a human being. And their membership in any ethnic group or racial group is enormously secondary and entirely irrelevant to their moral character. But they would embrace individualism, but they don't. They fight it to the death. They claim that colorblind individualism is also to defend colorblind individualism is also a microaggression, right? So your question, Joel, leads right into that. What does it do to somebody's self-esteem? It shatters it, I think, at both levels. The white kids are taught that they're inherently immoral because it's baked into their skin. It's baked. I mean, it's not funny. It's horrible. It's baked into their racial origins. Their ancestors, committed crimes of slavery and so on, but they inherit, it's like original sin. They inherited, the sins of their ancestors, and so they're bad. This undermines their self-esteem. And for the kids of color, they're helpless. They're victims. They can't make their own way in the world. To even suggest that they can is a microaggression. So, it undermines the self-esteem of of all parties involved. It's a horror. And by the way, let me one last point for the white kids. So they got to get blamed for slavery and everything else. But if moral responsibility is based in race, then the good things that your racial ancestors did, you should get credit for, just as the bad things you should get blamed for. So let's start a big group. Well, Aristotle and Newton and Shakespeare and Mozart and George Washington, all these guys, they were all white people, and they made all these advances in science and philosophy and political freedom, and Edison with invented the light bulb, and the Wright brothers with the airplane, and they've made life so much better for all of us, including people of color. So yay for the white people. They should that makes as much sense. Now, obviously, I didn't invent the light bulb, so I shouldn't get any credit for it. But if racial, if moral blame is placed on somebody for the crimes of their ancestors, then it makes as much sense that moral praise should be given to them for the great advances of their racial ancestors as well. But the racists we're talking about who pushed us, so they don't want to hear that part of it.
Well, of course, that doesn't happen. We don't have that other side of the equation, and it's clear that the purveyors of these ideas are not interested in elevating humanity. They're interested in looking for ways to tear down. Now, we can tell that they have their origins in Marxism. A Marxist ideology cannot have individual achievers. It can't have heroes. It can't have people who show that they are capable of living on their own means, because that would wipe out the justification for collectivism. So we know that they have their origins in that, where they are using as a substitute for, because racism is the is just part of the equation for calculating privilege. It's just the one that's most often used because it's the most perceptually obvious for people, and you don't need to be a great thinker to recognize whether somebody has this color or that color in their skin. But it's really just an excuse to it's just that race happens to be the easiest way to distinguish between individuals. It's just an excuse. It's another way to tear down and justify the use of emotional and psychological terror in order to create compliance.
It's
And you know
really
what?
true.
What political? I'm sorry, Deanna. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say it's just really true. I mean, Dr. Andy pointed out that it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day today, which is a great hero and wonderful messaging in our American history, and he should be celebrated. But those people that are pushing privilege and this agenda or this ideology, if you'll allow that, are the ones that also don't like Dr. Martin Luther King. They disparage him because he was an individualist, because he promoted this idea of being colorblind. They don't want that. They want to push this Marxist agenda however they can. And they want to separate people. They want this, racial war, because what you're seeing, I mean, if you just turn on the news on any BLM protest, what you see are a lot of young white kids. I'll call them kids because I'm older, but young white adults, maybe in their late teens, early 20s, and they're shouting at African Americans, telling them, like calling them names, Uncle Tom, all of these names, and shouting at them and telling them that they don't respect the rights of Black people or whatever narrative they're yelling. And that is horrific. And so what this idea of privilege is doing to an entire generation, and probably more than one if it continues, is that it's teaching them to feel shame and take that shame, and it builds this rage, and they don't know what to do with it because you're born. You don't get to choose your parents, right? And you're just born. I was born.
Deanna and Antifa knows what to do with it.
Yes, it's very, very what's the word? Direct in what they're doing.
Violent.
But these young kids that are being brought up in, education and are subjected to this privilege walk and are subjected to the curriculum when they're little kids, oh my gosh, it is heartbreaking, because to deprogram, because it is indoctrination, to deprogram that is going to take a lot of work.
Right.
I don't know how it's going to get done.
You're right, Dr. D. But also, Joel, a practical political conclusion here. You're right. This is pushed by Marxism. And one economic goal of Marxism, going back to Marx and Engels themselves, Communist Manifesto, 1848, is to level the playing field economically. Is to redistribute, coercively, use the power of the state to coercively redistribute income. The Robin Hood state, right? Take from the rich, give to the poor. Well, right now, in the United States, there's a large white American middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy class. Working people who work hard, earn their money, and they don't want to give it away to the poor. They may want to give a little bit, but they're not going to give, most of their money away to the poor. They're going to use it to send their kids to college, and they're going to spend it on themselves and their family. Well, if we could shame the kids growing up from a very young age, from 5, 6, 7 years old, that their wealth is ill-gotten based on abusive and oppressive white privilege. When they get into their 20s, 20 years down the road, and they're working and they're paying taxes, they're going to be much more amenable to Bernie Sanders kind of confiscatory schemes, and they're going to be much more willing to give their money away to the state for redistribution to the oppressed. So I mean, that's one very concrete, practical, political goal that this accomplishes. But there are much deeper, much more nefarious, I think, aspects at work here.
Well, there is no end to it, really. There's no amount of reparations that any person can make that will make it okay. There's no way that you can shed your privilege. There's only an endless well of sacrifice. There's nothing you can do to make it better.
Right. That's right. That's right. And I want to say, rationally and honestly, to anybody who sincerely opposes racism. And again, this is Martin Luther King Day. For all of his flaws, we're going to do a hero show episode on him tomorrow. And he was a flawed hero. Many of the people we've honored, Thomas Jefferson, as an example, is a flawed hero. We're not shy about pointing out the flaws, but we glorify the greatness. And Martin Luther King emphasizing content of character over color of skin. That's vitally important to combat racism anywhere in the world, in any of its hideous iterations. For anybody who sincerely cares to combat racism, individualism is the only panacea. It's the only individualism and individual rights is the only protection any of us have. And so that's the cure for racism in any form, that we recognize human beings are first, foremost, and always individuals who make moral choices, and we judge them as moral agents, not as members of a race. That's critical. And the people you're talking about, so they'd be horrified when they say, that's fighting words to them. That shows they have no interest in combating racism. Their interest is to use racism to gain they're Marxists. They want a communist society. They use racism, race war, as they've always used class war, to gain political power.
Well, to wrap this up, I just want to once again explore that idea of privilege as being cognitively destructive for students, particularly as they go through their education, to be thrown this idea of having an unearned guilt that you should feel shame for things you have no control over, and to extol the virtue of sacrifice in order to somehow make amends for something that you haven't done, that which is an endless road that you'll never be able to end. So what does that do to cognition as a young person learning how to exist in the world? You undergo your studies, your education, in order to see examples where you can put connect the dots, put two and two together, find that your mind is capable of making these associations and integrations, and you find that you will be able to survive in the world. But this thing called privilege is a short circuit to that process, because you'll find that if you are one of the privileged, you are characterized as somebody who doesn't deserve what you have. And if you are on the other side of the equation and you're the non-privileged, you're the oppressed, then you'll learn that you can't survive no matter what, because you're a victim. What do you guys have to add about the idea of privilege being cognitively destructive?
Well, one thing I would say is it certainly undermines motivation. If I'm a young kid and I'm an ambitious kid and I want to get an education, go on, have a productive career, as I always want to be a writer, and somebody else wants to be an entrepreneur, and so on and so forth. The idea is, well, no matter how much I study and learn, and no matter how hard I work, my success is based on undeserved characteristics, on my skin color, on my racial inheritance, not on my own, on my own initiative, not on my own responsibility. So I think it certainly undermines anybody's ambitious desire to legitimately achieve academically, commercially. I think it's terribly destructive to one's motivation to learn, because the success is always attributed to my undeserved racial inheritance, not to my own initiative and hard work.
Absolutely. It does undermine the idea of individual achievement, but we see that anyway in schools where they're doing away with certain grades. You can't get lower than 50%. So, if you turn in one assignment, you get 75. So one assignment equals a C if there are two assignments, right? If you get 50 and then 100, you get a C. Whereas somebody who works really hard, and does all the work, they're gonna, gonna get an A. And if you don't do any work, then you get 50%. So what this does is, like the grading system, which is this is all part of that, because they're considering that if you give Fs, that's racist. You can no longer give bad marks because that's racist. They're teaching this to kids on every level in school, and everything is tied to race. So you, like what Dr. Andy said, you can't win. You're either going to be shamed or you're a victim, and there's no self-esteem from that. There's nowhere to go from that unless you just reject it. And that takes a really strong kind of individual. And at a young age, the younger this indoctrination happens, that's going to be harder to find for those kids to kind of just, stand out or just reject all of this ideology, because it's peer pressure. And we're seeing this in schools.
Well, parents, I hope we've painted a dire enough picture for you about the sheer ugliness and perniciousness of this idea, and really the only way to combat this. I mean, how are you going to go to your school board meetings and try to argue against privilege in the context of the world we live in? Really, the best option, and we can all say it together: homeschool.
Homeschool.
Yep. Take your kids out, save their brains, save their self-esteem, save their souls.
All right. Well, on that note, on that very happy, bright, and cheery note, we'll call an end to this episode of The Rational Educator. Thanks again to our learned panel, Drs. Heikkinen and Bernstein. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for doing it, Joe. It's good to be here.
Thank you.